May 28, 1942. The radio intercept station, Kure Naval Base, Japan. The headphones crackle with the hiss of distant transmissions. Radio operator second class Noboru Ishikawa adjusts the frequency dial with practiced precision, his fingers moving across the surface like a pianist searching for the right note. The Pacific is alive with American radio traffic, voice transmissions, coded broadcasts, the constant electromagnetic chatter of a military machine in motion. Ishikawa's job is to listen, to record, to pass along anything that might matter to the intelligence officers who sit in the adjacent room, smoking cigarettes and studying maps. The intercept station at Kure is one of the most sophisticated communications intelligence facilities in the Japanese military. For 2 years, operators have been monitoring American naval broadcasts, recording call signs, tracking patterns, attempting to break codes. The work is tedious and often fruitless. Much of what comes through the headphones is either encrypted beyond current Japanese cryptographic capability or is routine administrative traffic of no strategic value. But occasionally, something emerges from the static that makes the tedium worthwhile. Ishikawa has been listening to American frequencies since dawn. His ears are slightly numb from the constant pressure of the headphones. The coffee in his cup has gone cold. His shift is nearly complete when something catches his attention. An American voice, clear and distinct, unencrypted. A transmission that would, within hours, make its way to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's headquarters, be discussed, analyzed, and then, catastrophically, ignored. The American is communicating information about naval movements. The context is fragmentary from Ishikawa's perspective, but the content is unmistakable. The Americans know, somehow, impossibly, the Americans know about Operation MI, the planned Japanese attack on Midway Island scheduled for just days away. The American voice on the other end of this transmission is describing Japanese intentions with a precision that suggests not mere speculation, but actual intelligence. Ishikawa records the intercept meticulously. He notes the time, the frequency, the quality of the transmission. He marks it with a priority flag. Within minutes, a junior intelligence officer collects the transcription and carries it through the corridors of Kure Naval Base toward the office of Captain Yusuke Ishikawa, head of the Japanese Navy's Communications Intelligence Unit. What happens next is a mystery that has puzzled historians for decades. The intercept is received, it is reviewed, and then it is dismissed. The explanation that Japanese intelligence officers would later offer is that they believed the information was American deception, part of an elaborate trick to throw the Japanese Navy off balance before the real battle. The idea was not unreasonable in the abstract. Military deception is a real tool. The problem was that it was not deception. The Americans did know about Midway. They had broken Japanese naval codes. They had intercepted Japanese radio traffic. They had positioned their forces to intercept the Japanese attack fleet. And the Japanese Navy, despite intercepting this very evidence of their compromise, proceeded with their operation as if the warning did not exist. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Operation MI, the man who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor and who now orchestrated this attempt to draw the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement, was not even told about the intercepted American transmission. The decision to suppress or dismiss the intelligence was made at lower levels of command, by officers who either did not understand its significance or who were invested in the success of the operation and therefore inclined to rationalize away evidence that contradicted their hopes. In military history, there are moments where the arc of wars turns on decisions made in offices far from the actual fighting. This was one of those moments. The information was available. The warning had been transmitted. The Japanese Navy had demonstrated the capability to intercept American communications. But the organizational culture, the commitment to the operation, and the intelligence failures that cascade through military hierarchies had conspired to prevent the right people from understanding what they had in their hands. Noboru Ishikawa returned to his headphones. His shift ended. Another operator took his place. The intercept was filed away in archives that would eventually be destroyed or lost. And in the waters near Midway Island, 240 kilometers to the northwest, Japanese task forces continued their approach toward an engagement they believed they would win decisively. They had no idea that American carriers were waiting. May 26, 1942. The bridge of the Japanese battleship Yamato, 600 kilometers west of Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands on the bridge of his flagship, the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, a floating palace of Japanese naval power. Around him, the combined fleet stretches across the Pacific in a carefully orchestrated formation. For fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, and Hiryu, 2 heavy cruisers, a dozen destroyers, battleships, submarine squadrons, over 200 combat aircraft. By any measure, it is the most powerful naval force ever assembled. Yamamoto is 58 years old, thin, with the bearing of a man who has spent his entire adult life at sea. His face is weathered, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue that marks every senior commander in the Japanese Navy in the spring of 1942. He holds a cigarette between his fingers. He smokes constantly, a nervous habit born from decades decades of stress, and studies the maps before him with an intensity that suggests he is trying to solve an equation that has no solution. The operation that is unfolding is Yamamoto's masterpiece of strategic thinking. After the attack on Pearl Harbor had failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers, after the initial Japanese victories had begun to stall against American industrial capacity, Yamamoto had conceived a bold plan. If Japan could not win a war of attrition, then Japan must win a decisive battle. One engagement, fought under favorable conditions, where the Japanese Navy could destroy the American Pacific Fleet and force the United States to negotiate peace. Operation MI, the attack on Midway, is designed to accomplish exactly this. The Japanese are using Midway as bait, a small atoll, militarily insignificant except for its strategic location. The Japanese will attack it, and the Americans, defending what they believe to be an important possession, will send their carriers to respond. The Japanese, with superior numbers and the advantage of surprise, will ambush and destroy them. Then, with American naval power crippled, Japan can consolidate its conquests and negotiate from a position of strength. It is elegant in conception. It is also built on a series of assumptions, each one increasingly fragile. Assumption 1. The Americans do not know about the operation. This assumption is already violated. The Americans have broken Japanese naval codes. They know the attack is coming. They are preparing an ambush of their own. But Yamamoto does not know this. Or rather, the intelligence had reached lower-level Japanese officers and had been dismissed as deception. Assumption 2. The Japanese can achieve surprise. This depends entirely on assumption 1. Without surprise, Japanese numerical superiority becomes less decisive. The Americans have 3 carriers in the Pacific. Japan has 4. In a fair fight, Japanese training and experience might give them an edge. But in a surprise engagement, where one side can launch attacks while the other is still launching aircraft, numerical advantage becomes overwhelming. Assumption 3. The American carriers can be found and destroyed. This assumes that American commanders will cooperate with Japanese plans, that they will position their carriers where Japanese search planes can find them, and that they will proceed with the battle according to Japanese strategic expectations. This assumption ignores the possibility that American commanders might have their own intelligence, their own plans, their own willingness to adapt. Yamamoto is aware of these risks in theory. He has wargamed the operation with his staff. He knows the vulnerabilities, but he also knows that if this operation fails, Japan's prospects for victory collapse entirely. The longer the war continues, the more American production surpasses Japanese capacity. Japan is already losing the race for industrial output. The war has become a mathematics problem, and the mathematics are turning decisively against Japan. So Yamamoto has committed himself to this gamble. He is betting the Japanese Navy on a single engagement. He is betting that Japanese skill and courage and determination can overcome American resources. He is betting that one brilliant victory can change the trajectory of the entire war. What he does not know, what he has not been told, is that the Americans have already seen his playbook. They are not preparing to defend Midway. They are preparing to sink his carriers. The Yamato cuts through the Pacific swells. The morning sun glints off steel superstructures. Somewhere to the east, aircraft mechanics are servicing Zero fighters, loading ammunition into wings, preparing for combat. Pilots are reviewing navigation charts, memorizing approach vectors, mentally rehearsing the attacks they will soon execute. Enlisted men throughout the fleet are at their stations, performing thousands of small tasks that constitute the machinery of naval warfare. No one knows that they are sailing toward catastrophe. No one knows that within 72 hours, 4 of the finest aircraft carriers in the world will rest on the ocean floor, taking with them nearly 3,500 Japanese sailors and pilots. No one knows that this battle will mark the precise moment when Japanese naval superiority in the Pacific ends forever. Yamamoto smokes his cigarette and watches the horizon, waiting for the battle to begin. May 20, 1942. Fleet Radio Intelligence Unit, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 3 days before Yamamoto's transmission, Commander Joseph Rochefort sits in a basement office that smells of cigarette smoke, sweat, and the peculiar mustiness of classified documents. The walls are covered with charts, diagrams, photographs of Japanese ships, and cryptographic notations that would be meaningless to anyone without specialized training. Rochefort is 39 years old, a career naval officer with an obsessive mind and a gift for languages. He speaks Japanese fluently. He has studied cryptography for years. He lives and breathes the Japanese Navy's radio traffic. Around him, a team of linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators work in controlled frenzy. The basement office, designated Station Hypo, is one of the 3 main American code-breaking facilities in the Pacific. Its counterparts are in Melbourne, Australia, and in Washington, D.C. But Rochefort's operation is the most productive, the most aggressive, the most willing to take risks in pursuit of intelligence. For months, Rochefort's team has been working on the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. It is not a simple substitution cipher. It is a complex system involving additive tables, substitutions, and layers of encryption. Cracking it completely is beyond American capability. But Rochefort has discovered something almost as valuable: patterns, repetitions, stereotyped phrases that recur in Japanese military traffic. By identifying these patterns and comparing them across multiple intercepts, Rochefort has learned to read fragments of Japanese naval communications even when he cannot decrypt them entirely. What he has discovered over the past weeks is that the Japanese Navy is planning something massive: large fleet movements, references to an operation designated with the code letters MI, mentions of a date in early June, references to carrier task forces. The intelligence is fragmentary, but it is unmistakable. The Japanese are planning a major operation. The question is, what is MI? Rochefort brings his findings to his commanding officer, Captain Edwin T. Layton, who is the fleet intelligence officer. Layton is skeptical. The intelligence is circumstantial. The actual target of the operation is not explicitly stated in any intercept that American codebreakers have been able to read. But Rochefort is insistent. His instinct, honed by months of studying Japanese patterns, tells him that MI refers to Midway Island. To verify this hypothesis, Rochefort proposes an audacious experiment. He will contact the commanding officer at Midway and ask him to broadcast, in the clear, that the island's water purification system has broken down and that they need fresh water supplies. Rochefort is betting that the Japanese will intercept this message, understand it as a reference to Midway's vulnerability, and in their subsequent encrypted traffic will reference the fact that MI has water problems. If this happens, Rochefort will have confirmed through cryptographic logic that MI equals Midway. The experiment works. Within hours of Midway's unencrypted broadcast about water problems, Rochefort's team intercepts Japanese encrypted traffic mentioning that MI has water problems. The confirmation is absolute. The target is Midway. The operation is scheduled for early June. The Japanese carriers are moving toward it. Rochefort brings this intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz listens carefully. He asks questions. He probes for weaknesses in Rochefort's analysis. And then he makes a decision that will determine the outcome of the Pacific War. He believes Rochefort. He commits American naval forces to defend against the attack. He positions his three carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to intercept the Japanese fleet. He briefs his task force commanders on Japanese tactics, Japanese carrier doctrine, and the likely approach vectors for Japanese aircraft. Most critically, Nimitz gives his subordinate commanders the freedom to adapt and improvise. He tells Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task forces, that while American doctrine emphasizes following battle plans precisely, this battle is different. This battle requires flexibility. Adapt, react, trust your judgment. In Japan, in the same time frame, Admiral Yamamoto is receiving intelligence reports that are far less precise, far less useful. Japanese intelligence officers have provided him with estimates of American carrier locations that are vague and based partly on outdated information. Japanese scouts have not conducted thorough reconnaissance of American positions. Japanese naval doctrine, unlike American doctrine being developed in real time by Nimitz, emphasizes rigid adherence to plans and hierarchical command structures that make adaptation difficult. The stage is set. On one side of the Pacific, an American admiral who knows his enemy's plans, who has prepared his forces accordingly, and who has empowered his subordinates to act with initiative. On the other side, a Japanese admiral who is operating with incomplete information and who has dismissed warnings that his plans have been compromised. The irony is that the warning had come through. Yamamoto's communications officer had intercepted American radio traffic confirming that the U.S. knew about Midway, but the message had been lost in the noise of military bureaucracy. The intelligence had been received and dismissed as deception. By the time Yamamoto was ready to launch his attack, he did not know that he was walking into an ambush. He was about to learn. June 4, 1942, 0600 hours. The flight deck of the USS Enterprise, 200 kilometers northeast of Midway. The sun rises over the Pacific, revealing a sea that is deceptively calm. The water is nearly flat, with only gentle swells. The visibility is excellent, too excellent. Cloud cover is minimal. Conditions for naval aviation are nearly perfect. They are also conditions that will allow Japanese pilots to see American carriers, and American pilots to see Japanese carriers. On the flight decks of 3 American carriers, aircraft are being prepared for launch. F-4F Wildcat fighters are being armed with ammunition and fuel. Douglas Dauntless dive bombers are being loaded with 500-pound bombs. Devastator torpedo bombers are being fitted with Mark 13 torpedoes, weapons that are notoriously unreliable but are all the Americans have available. Pilots are receiving final briefings from their squadron commanders. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bomber squadron from the Enterprise, has been briefed on what to expect. He knows the Japanese carriers are out there somewhere to the west. He knows approximately where they should be. He knows that if American pilots can find them before Japanese carriers find American carriers, the advantage shifts decisively to the US. He also knows that if he fails to find the Japanese, if his squadron launches and fires finds only empty ocean, then Japanese aircraft will be free to attack American carriers with unimpeded fury. The mathematics of carrier warfare are brutal and unforgiving. Whoever finds the enemy first and launches their aircraft first gains an overwhelming advantage. The losing side's carriers, caught with aircraft still being fueled and armed on their flight decks, become vulnerable to torpedo and bomb attacks. Damage to a carrier's flight deck can put it out of action for months or permanently. 3 carriers is not many. Lose even one, and American naval power in the Pacific is crippled. At 0800 hours, American reconnaissance aircraft report a sighting. Japanese carriers have been located. The position is given. McCluskey and other American squadron commanders immediately launch their aircraft. Dozens of planes lift off the flight decks, climb to altitude, and head toward the reported position of the Japanese fleet. The pilots know they are flying toward combat. Most of them will not return. Simultaneously, Japanese search planes have finally located American carriers. The Japanese are shocked. They had not expected American carriers to be positioned where they are. The Japanese had planned to have Japanese aircraft attacking American carriers while those carriers were still in the process of launching their own aircraft. Instead, American aircraft are already airborne. Worse, from the Japanese perspective, is what is happening on the flight decks of Japanese carriers. When Japanese search planes reported American carrier sightings, the Japanese carriers were in the process of recovering aircraft that had been attacking Midway Island. The flight decks are crowded with aircraft that have just landed, aircraft that are now being refueled and rearmed for a second strike against either Midway or American carriers, depending on which target proves more valuable. It is at this moment that American dive bombers, led by McCluskey, arrive over the Japanese fleet. The Akagi is the first to be attacked. American Dauntless dive bombers plunge from altitude, dropping 500-pound bombs toward the massive carrier. The Akagi is Yamamoto's flagship in a sense. It is the carrier from which the Pearl Harbor attack was coordinated, the ship most symbolic of Japanese naval power. Bombs strike the flight deck. Fire erupts. The ship is transformed in seconds from an instrument of naval power into a burning wreck. The Kaga is attacked moments later. More bombs. More fires. The Soryu is attacked. Bombs penetrate the flight deck. Fires spread below deck, consuming stored fuel, burning ammunition, incinerating pilots and sailors in compartments they cannot escape from. Within minutes, literally minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers are mortally wounded. The Hiryu, the only Japanese fleet carrier that escapes the initial American attack, desperately launches its remaining aircraft in counterattack. American carriers are struck. The Yorktown is hit by bombs and torpedoes. It is crippled but not sunk. American pilots, showing extraordinary courage and skill, manage to locate the Hiryu and attack it. More bombs. More fires. The Hiryu burns and eventually sinks. By the end of the day on June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese fleet carriers have been sunk or fatally damaged. Approximately 3,500 Japanese sailors and pilots are dead. Hundreds of trained Japanese pilots, irreplaceable in a way that American pilots are not, because Japan has no system for rotating experienced pilots home to train new ones, have been killed. The Japanese Navy has suffered a catastrophic defeat. The battle at Midway is not over yet. Japanese surface forces will continue to maneuver, hoping for a night engagement where Japanese naval gun superiority might prove decisive. But Japanese commanders know by nightfall on June 4 that the outcome is determined. The Japanese have lost. In the darkness of the Pacific, damaged American ships limp toward port. Damaged Japanese ships sink or are scuttled. Survivors swim in oily water or cling to wreckage. Corpses float in life jackets. The battle that Yamamoto had planned as the beginning of Japanese dominance over the American Pacific Fleet has instead become the moment when that dominance ended forever. Yamamoto is informed of the losses as they are reported throughout the day. Carrier after carrier reported lost. The shock is profound. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, all gone. The 4 finest carriers in the Japanese Navy, the ships that had struck at Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Indian Ocean in triumph, that had seemed invincible, were now wreckage on the ocean floor. June 5, 1942, evening. The bridge of the Yamato, 600 kilometers west of Midway. Admiral Yamamoto has not slept. He has stood on the bridge of the Yamato for nearly 36 hours, receiving reports, issuing orders, attempting to salvage something from catastrophe. But the mathematics are inexorable. The reports continue to arrive. The Akagi is burning beyond recovery. The Kaga has sunk. The Soryu has gone down. The Hiryu, despite heroic efforts by her crew, is burning and will be scuttled. 4 carriers gone. The Admiral is 60 years old now, though the past 36 hours have aged him years. His face is ashen. His hands shake slightly as he lights another cigarette. Around him, his staff moves quietly, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding his gaze. There is a protocol for military defeat, and Yamamoto is following it with the precision of a man who has spent his entire career in service to the Japanese Navy. But beneath the protocol, beneath the formal military bearing, is a man confronting the destruction of his strategy, his hopes, his understanding of how how the war would unfold. Yamamoto had gambled everything on one battle. He had been warned by subordinates that the strategy was risky, that the plan depended too heavily on luck and surprise. He had proceeded anyway, believing that Japanese superiority in naval training and tactical skill could overcome American numbers. He had believed that one decisive victory could change the trajectory of the entire war. Now, in the span of a few hours, that belief has been obliterated. A staff officer approaches and quietly informs Yamamoto that American forces are continuing to conduct air attacks. Japanese battleships and cruisers are being damaged. The American carrier Yorktown, though crippled, is being protected by American escorts and is likely to survive. There is talk of a night engagement, of using Japanese battleships to attack American forces under cover of darkness. But Yamamoto knows this is grasping at straws. The decisive battle has been fought. It has been lost. No night engagement, no subsequent maneuver, will change that fundamental fact. Yamamoto retreats to his quarters late on June 5th. He is alone, or as alone as an admiral on a battleship can be. He sits at a small desk and composes a message to be sent to Tokyo, to the Naval General Staff, to the Emperor. The message is a model of military restraint. It does not whine or make excuses. It states the facts. 4 carriers have been lost. American naval power remains intact. The operation has failed. But what Yamamoto does not say in official communications, he does say privately to those closest to him, to his chief of staff, to selected captains, to officers he trusts. Yamamoto makes statements that are recorded in various accounts and that later became part of the historical record. These statements are remarkable for their clarity and their implications. From now on, the fate of the war will be determined by industrial production, Yamamoto tells his staff. This is not an offhand comment. This is a strategic assessment, spoken by the man who perhaps understands American industrial capacity better than any senior Japanese military officer. Yamamoto had served as a naval attaché in the United States. He had toured American factories. He had seen the scale of American manufacturing. He understood, in a way that many Japanese military leaders did not, that America possessed productive capacity that Japan could not match, could not hope to match, could not match even if Japan fought perfectly for 10 more years. Yamamoto had believed that one brilliant victory could compensate for this industrial disparity. He had believed that destroying the American Pacific Fleet would force the United States to negotiate, to accept Japanese conquests, to allow Japan to consolidate its empire. This belief had been the foundation of his entire strategy. Now, with 4 carriers on the ocean floor, the belief has been proven catastrophically wrong. In subsequent days, Yamamoto makes additional statements to his subordinates. One account records him saying, "We have lost the war." Another records him telling a visiting officer, "I shall not be able to ask for your continued support if we continue to pursue offensive operations." The clear implication is that further offensive operations will only accelerate Japanese defeat, that the time for aggressive strategy has ended, that Japan must now prepare for a defensive war it cannot win. These statements are devastating in their finality. This is not the talk of a military commander who believes he can recover from a setback. This is the language of a strategist who has confronted a fundamental truth. Without a decisive victory, without American willingness to negotiate, Japan faces attrition against an enemy whose industrial base is vastly superior. Japan can win individual battles. Japan can inflict casualties on American forces, but Japan cannot win a prolonged war of production and industrial capacity. What makes Yamamoto's realization even more poignant is that he had warned his own government about this very scenario before Pearl Harbor. In conversations with Japanese political leaders, Yamamoto had expressed doubt about Japan's ability to win a long war against the United States. He had said, in effect, "If you want to fight America, let me strike one decisive blow at Pearl Harbor. This will give Japan a window of opportunity, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year. During that window, we must win decisively, or we will lose the war." Yamamoto had never believed that Japan could sustain itself in a prolonged conflict with American industrial power. Now, that prophecy has begun to be fulfilled. The window of opportunity is closing. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Japan had achieved remarkable conquests. But the Americans had not been defeated. The American Navy had been battered but not destroyed. And now, at Midway, the moment of decision had arrived, and Japan had made the wrong decisions. Japan had failed to achieve the decisive victory. Japan was now entering the prolonged conflict that Yamamoto had said would lead to defeat. The Admiral cannot undo the past. He cannot recall the carriers that lie on the ocean floor. He cannot resurrect the pilots who died at Midway. He can only face forward into a future that he now understands will end in Japanese defeat unless something fundamental changes. And in Japanese military and political culture in 1942, nothing fundamental can change. The war will continue. It will last years. It will consume millions of lives. And it will end exactly as Yamamoto now knows it will end, with Japanese surrender. But for now, in the darkness of June 5, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto simply smokes his cigarettes and contemplates the war that he has lost, even if the fighting will continue for 3 more years. June 6 to 10, 1942. Japanese Naval Intelligence, pure naval base. In the days following the Midway disaster, Japanese naval intelligence officers begin attempting to reconstruct what happened. How did American forces know where to find Japanese carriers? How did American pilots arrive at precisely the moment when Japanese flight decks were most vulnerable? How did the Americans achieve such tactical advantage in what was supposed to be a decisive Japanese victory? The answers, when they emerge from investigation, are fragments of a larger truth that Japanese intelligence officials cannot fully comprehend. Some officers recognize that American code-breaking may have played a role. Others suspect that Japanese communications had been compromised. But the full scope of American signals intelligence, the systematic breaking of Japanese naval codes, the radio direction finding, the traffic analysis, remains beyond Japanese understanding. What Japanese naval intelligence does recognize, with growing horror, is that the intercepted American message from May 28, the transmission that had indicated Americans knew about Midway, was not deception. It was real intelligence. American forces genuinely had known about the operation, and Japanese intelligence, at lower levels of command, had received this warning and dismissed it. The officer primarily responsible for this dismissal is Captain Yusuke Ishikawa, head of the Communications Intelligence Unit. Ishikawa had received the intercept. Ishikawa had determined that it was likely American deception or strategic feint. Ishikawa had decided not to escalate the warning to Admiral Yamamoto or to modify Japanese operational planning based on the intercept. The investigation into Ishikawa's decision becomes heated. Some officers believe he should be court-martialed for dereliction of duty. Others defend him, arguing that the intercept was ambiguous and that determining it was authentic intelligence rather than deception required making a judgment call under uncertainty. The debate reflects a deeper organizational dysfunction within Japanese military intelligence, a system that prioritizes hierarchy and commitment to existing plans over flexibility and adaptation based on new information. Ultimately, no formal charges are brought against Ishikawa. He is reassigned, his career effectively ended, but he is not prosecuted. The Japanese military cannot afford to publicly admit that an intelligence failure contributed to the Midway disaster. The official narrative, carefully constructed by the Navy General Staff, is that the operation failed due to tactical factors, bad luck, poor weather, American pilot skill. The narrative does not emphasize the intelligence failure. It cannot. To do so would raise uncomfortable questions about whether Japanese military leadership had adequate warning and chose to proceed anyway. But within the closed circles of Japanese military command, the truth is known. The Americans had known. The warning had been received and dismissed. The intelligence failure had been catastrophic. Admiral Yamamoto, in private conversations, acknowledges the failure. He does not blame Ishikawa directly. He understands the pressures and uncertainties that drive military decision-making. But he recognizes that the dismissal of the intelligence warning represents a fundamental vulnerability in Japanese military organization. The Japanese military system is designed to execute plans, not to adapt to unexpected information. Once a plan is set, changing it requires going through chains of command that are designed to enforce consistency and hierarchy rather than encourage flexibility. The American military system, by contrast, had demonstrated exactly the opposite characteristic. Admiral Nimitz had received intelligence from Rochefort that suggested American carriers should be positioned in a specific location. Nimitz had believed the intelligence and acted on it. When his commanders received additional information in real time, Japanese carrier sightings, changing tactical situations, they had been empowered to adapt their tactics. The American system had proven more adaptive, more responsive, more capable of converting intelligence into operational advantage. This difference in military organizational culture would prove to be one of the crucial factors determining the outcome of the Pacific War. Over the next 3 years, American forces would repeatedly demonstrate an ability to gather intelligence, process it, and convert it into tactical advantage. Japanese forces, by contrast, would become increasingly rigid, increasingly committed to set plans, increasingly unable to respond to unexpected information. The intelligence failure at Midway was not the cause of this organizational problem, but it was a symptom, a visible manifestation of a deeper dysfunction that would plague Japanese military operations throughout the war. In the weeks following Midway, as the extent of Japanese losses becomes clear, Japanese military leaders attempt to disguise the catastrophe from the Japanese public. The official announcement claims that Japanese forces are continuing to conduct aggressive operations, and that American losses are significant. There is no mention of 4 carriers being sunk. The Japanese public continues to believe, based on official communiques, that Japan is winning the war. This information control prevents Japanese society from understanding the true state of the war. It also prevents Japanese political leaders from accurately assessing the situation and potentially considering strategic alternatives, such as negotiating a peace settlement with the United States. By maintaining the fiction that Japan is winning, Japanese military leadership ensures that the war will continue, that American industrial capacity will have more time to convert American material resources into military superiority, that Japanese defeat becomes more inevitable with every passing month. Yamamoto understands this dynamic. He knows that the Japanese government, and indeed the Japanese military command structure above him, does not want to hear that the war is lost. They want to hear about plans for victory. Yamamoto provides those plans, even though he no longer believes in them. He prepares new offensives, new carrier operations, new attempts to achieve the decisive battle that will never come. But in his private conversations, Yamamoto continues to speak the truth. In one account, he tells a visitor, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." These words have been attributed to him, though the exact phrasing may be apocryphal. But the sentiment is authentic. Yamamoto had understood, before Pearl Harbor, that attacking America was a gamble. Now, after Midway, he understands that the gamble has failed. America is indeed awakened. America is filled with resolve. And America's resolve is backed by an industrial capacity that Japan cannot overcome. The Admiral continues to serve, continues to plan, continues to conduct operations. But he does so in the knowledge that he is fighting a war that Japan has already lost, a war that will continue for years, consuming millions of lives, but will end in the same place, Japanese defeat. The intelligence failure at Midway, the dismissal of warning signals, the organizational inability to adapt to new information, had cost Japan 4 carriers and 3,500 sailors and pilots. But more significantly, it had cost Japan any remaining possibility of achieving the decisive victory that might have changed the trajectory of the war. The battle was fought over 3 days in June 1942. Its consequences would echo for the remainder of the Pacific War and far beyond. 1942-1945. The Pacific Theater, 3 years of war continuing. The Battle of Midway ends on June 7, 1942, but the war in the Pacific continues for 3 more years. For American forces, Midway represents a turning point, the moment when the initiative passes from Japanese hands to American hands. For the next 36 months, American forces will conduct an island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, each island representing a brutal battle, each campaign moving closer to the Japanese homeland. Yamamoto lives to see only the first year of this new phase of the war. In April 1943, he is killed when American fighter pilots, acting on intelligence provided by American codebreakers who had intercepted his travel plans, ambush his transport plane over the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto dies in combat, appropriately enough for a career naval officer, but he dies knowing that his prophecies about Japanese defeat have begun to be fulfilled. In his place come other Japanese commanders, men who perhaps do not fully understand, or do not wish to acknowledge, the strategic reality that Yamamoto had grasped. These commanders prepare defensive positions, conduct counteroffensives, attempt to hold Pacific Islands against American assault. But they are fighting against an American military machine that is growing stronger with every passing month. American carrier production exceeds Japanese production by a factor of 10. American pilot training produces thousands of replacements every year. American industrial capacity is converting itself into military hardware at a scale that dwarfs Japanese efforts. Japanese losses in carrier pilots are particularly catastrophic. Unlike the American system, where experienced pilots are rotated home to train new pilots after completing a certain number of combat missions, the Japanese system keeps pilots in combat until they are killed. As a result, Japanese pilot training declines catastrophically as the war progresses. By 1944, Japanese carrier pilots are inexperienced and poorly trained compared to their American counterparts. The result is increasingly lopsided air battles where American pilots with less training but supported by superior industrial production defeat Japanese pilots with more individual experience but less organizational support. The intelligence war continues throughout the war. American codebreakers continue to break Japanese codes, though the Japanese periodically change their codes and occasionally achieve periods where Americans cannot read their traffic. But the overall advantage remains with American intelligence. American forces repeatedly demonstrate an ability to anticipate Japanese movements, to position forces to counter Japanese attacks, to achieve tactical surprise by converting strategic intelligence into operational advantage. Japanese military intelligence, by contrast, remains plagued by the same organizational and cultural problems that had contributed to the Midway disaster. Japanese commanders often lack accurate information about American positions and strengths. Japanese estimates of American industrial capacity are frequently wildly inaccurate, sometimes overestimated, sometimes underestimated, but rarely matching reality. Japanese military leaders make strategic decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate intelligence, leading to operations that fail or produce results opposite to those intended. The most famous example of this dynamic is the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American forces destroy Japanese carrier aviation in what becomes known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese commanders, lacking accurate intelligence about American carrier locations and American fighter aircraft capabilities, commit Japanese carriers to battle under conditions that are disastrously unfavorable. Japanese pilots, many of them poorly trained replacements, are slaughtered by American pilots flying superior aircraft in numbers that overwhelm Japanese defenses. By the end of the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese carrier aviation has been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Japan has aircraft carriers remaining, but they have no trained pilots to fly from them and no realistic prospect of replacing the pilots who have been lost. Japanese naval power, already crippled at Midway, is now rendered completely impotent. For the remainder of the war, Japanese ships will be sunk by American forces with minimal opposition from Japanese aircraft. The intelligence failure at Midway, in retrospect, represents the moment when Japanese military effectiveness began its terminal decline. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway were replaced by new construction, but the pilots and crew members who died at Midway could not be replaced. The organizational learning that might have happened, the recognition that Japanese intelligence systems were deficient, that Japanese military planning was vulnerable to surprise, that Japanese organizational culture needed to adapt, this learning did not happen in ways that would have altered Japanese military effectiveness. Instead, Japanese military leadership continued down the same paths. They continued to dismiss intelligence warnings. They continued to execute rigid operational plans despite changing circumstances. They continued to assume that Japanese courage and determination could overcome American material superiority. With each passing year, this approach proved more disastrously wrong. By 1945, Japanese military leaders are committing pilots on suicide missions, kamikaze attacks, because they have no other way to inflict casualties on American forces. The war has become a matter of Japanese forces delaying inevitable defeat, trying to inflict enough casualties on Americans to make them willing to negotiate a peace settlement, trying desperately to preserve some fragment of Japanese power in a world that is being reshaped by American military victory. Yamamoto had understood, in June 1942, that this outcome was inevitable. He had understood that once Japan failed to achieve a decisive victory at Midway, Japan had lost the war. The fighting would continue for years. Japan would win individual battles. Japan would inflict casualties on American forces, but Japan would not win the war. Japan could not win the war. The mathematics of industrial production and material resources made Japanese victory impossible once the element of surprise was lost and American forces mobilized their full capacity. The Battle of Midway is often remembered as a turning point, the moment when Japanese naval dominance ended and American naval dominance began. This characterization is historically accurate, but the deeper significance of Midway, the reason it deserves to be called the turning point of the entire Pacific War, is not primarily naval. It is organizational, informational, and strategic. At Midway, American military intelligence demonstrated superiority over Japanese military intelligence. American military command demonstrated superior ability to act on intelligence, to adapt tactics based on changing circumstances, to empower subordinate commanders to make decisions. American military organization demonstrated flexibility in response to new information. Japanese military intelligence, by contrast, had received warning signals and dismissed them. Japanese military command demonstrated an inability to adapt when faced with unexpected circumstances. Japanese military organization was designed to execute predetermined plans rather than to respond flexibly to new information. These organizational differences had been present before Midway, but at Midway, they were tested in a battle where success or failure would determine the trajectory of an entire war. And in that test, American organizational superiority proved decisive. It would continue to prove decisive for the remainder of the war, as American forces gradually converted their material advantages into military victory through superior use of intelligence, superior adaptation to circumstances, and superior ability to learn from experience and apply those lessons to future operations. Yamamoto had understood this, in the darkness of June 5, 1942, when he had contemplated the destruction of 4 carriers and had recognized that Japan had lost the war. 3 years of fighting remained. Millions of lives would still be lost, but the outcome, from that moment forward, was never in doubt. May 28, 1942. Revisiting the Intercept Station, pure naval base. The road not taken. History is often understood through the lens of what actually happened. We analyze decisions that were made, battles that were fought, outcomes that occurred. But sometimes, understanding history requires considering what might have happened if different decisions had been made at critical moments. The intercept that radio operator Noboru Ishikawa received on May 28, 1942, the American transmission indicating that the US knew about the Midway attack, represents one of those critical moments. Imagine, for a moment, if Captain Yusuke Ishikawa, head of the Communications Intelligence Unit, had treated the intercept not as deception but as genuine warning. Imagine if he had immediately escalated the intelligence to Admiral Yamamoto with an assessment that American forces knew about Operation MI and were preparing to counter it. What would Yamamoto have done? The answer, based on Yamamoto's documented limited thinking and his private statements about the operation's risks, is that he likely would have cancelled or significantly modified the operation. Yamamoto was many things: aggressive, ambitious, strategically innovative, but he was not reckless in the way that some other Japanese military leaders were reckless. If Yamamoto had received credible intelligence that American forces knew his plan and were prepared to ambush him, he would have recognized that the entire foundation of the operation had been compromised. Operation MI depended entirely on surprise. Without surprise, the numerical advantages were marginal. 3 American carriers versus 4 Japanese carriers, with Japanese pilots more experienced but American aircraft production superior and American pilot replacement training more systematic. In a fair fight, without surprise, the outcome would be uncertain. With American forces knowing Japanese plans and having positioned forces to counter them, the outcome would be decisively American. Yamamoto would likely have postponed the operation, regrouped, and attempted a different approach. Japanese naval strategy would have been forced to adapt to the reality that Japanese communications had been compromised. Japanese security procedures would have been tightened. Future Japanese operations would have benefited from the knowledge that American forces possessed signals intelligence capabilities that were more sophisticated than Japanese intelligence officials had realized. Would this have changed the outcome of the Pacific War? Possibly. Possibly not, but it would certainly have changed the trajectory of 1942. It would have prevented the psychological blow of losing 4 carriers in a single day. It would have preserved Japanese carrier aviation for future operations. It would have bought time for Japanese military leadership to adapt to the reality of American signals intelligence superiority. But this did not happen. Captain Ishikawa dismissed the intercept as deception. The warning was not escalated. Yamamoto proceeded with the operation under the assumption that surprise had been maintained, and the result was catastrophe. The question that haunts military historians is, why did Ishikawa make the decision he made? The answer appears to be a combination of factors. First, the intercept was fragmentary. It did not explicitly state that the Americans knew about Midway. It was a single transmission, not multiple corroborating intercepts. In the context of signals intelligence, a single transmission can be misleading or misunderstood. Second, Ishikawa and other Japanese intelligence officers believed that American code-breaking capabilities were limited. They knew that the Americans had broken some Japanese codes, but they did not fully understand the sophistication of American signals intelligence operations. They were not aware of the systematic approach that American code breakers like Joseph Rochefort were taking, the pattern analysis, the traffic analysis, the methodical work of breaking codes piece by piece. Third, there was organizational pressure to maintain the operation. By late May 1942, Operation MI was in motion. Japanese forces were at sea. The operation had been approved by the highest levels of Japanese military command. Cancelling it, or even substantially modifying it based on a single fragmentary intercept, would require going against organizational momentum and hierarchy. It would require an intelligence officer to tell an admiral that a major operation needed to be called off because of a warning that might be deception. In Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on hierarchy and commitment to plans once approved, this was an extremely difficult thing to do. Fourth, there was the question of Japanese military pride. The idea that Americans had broken Japanese codes and were reading Japanese communications was deeply offensive to Japanese officers. There was a psychological resistance to believing that Japanese security procedures had been compromised. It was easier to believe that the intercept was American disinformation, an attempt to deceive the Japanese into cancelling an operation that was actually going to succeed, than to believe that Americans had actually penetrated Japanese communications security. These factors combined to produce a decision that, in retrospect, appears catastrophically wrong. But in the context of May 1942, with incomplete information and organizational pressures pointing in different directions, the decision was not obviously irrational. It was a judgment call made under uncertainty, and it was the wrong judgment call. The consequence of this wrong judgment call was the loss of 4 carriers, the death of 3,500 sailors and pilots, the destruction of trained Japanese carrier aviation, and the beginning of the end of Japanese naval superiority in the Pacific. All of this flowed from a decision made by a mid-level intelligence officer to dismiss a warning intercept as deception rather than to escalate it as a genuine intelligence alert. This pattern, the tendency of military organizations to dismiss or downplay warning signals that contradict organizational expectations, would repeat itself multiple times during World War II. American military intelligence would later receive warning signals about German offensive capabilities that were downplayed before the Battle of the Bulge. Soviet military intelligence would receive warnings about German invasion plans that Stalin dismissed reduced or minimized before Barbarossa. The tendency of military organizations to maintain existing plans and expectations even when confronted with intelligence that contradicts those plans is a recurring pattern in military history. What makes Midway significant is not just that it represents one more example of this pattern. It represents the moment when this pattern, this organizational dysfunction, this intelligence failure, determined the outcome of an entire war. The Battle of Midway was not primarily about which side had better tactics or better pilots or better ships. It was about which side had better intelligence and better organizational ability to act on that intelligence. American forces acted on intelligence from Rochefort that told them where to position their carriers. When that initial intelligence proved incomplete, American commanders adapted based on new information. Japanese forces, by contrast, had received intelligence warning that American forces knew their plans, and had dismissed that warning. When American forces appeared where they were supposed to appear, Japanese commanders had no contingency plans, no adaptive strategies, no flexibility to respond. The result was defeat so decisive that it determined the outcome of the war. Not immediately, the fighting continued for 3 more years. But in the mathematics of military power, the balance shifted irreversibly on June 4, 1942. From that moment forward, American industrial capacity, American ability to replace losses, American organizational effectiveness, would gradually convert tactical victories into strategic dominance. Yamamoto understood this. He had understood it in the darkness of June 5, 1942. He had tried to tell his government, his military leadership, his peers, but his warnings were not heeded. Japan continued the war. Japan continued to fight, but Japan was no longer fighting to win. Japan was fighting out of obligation, out of pride, out of inability to imagine surrender. 3 years later, after millions more had died, Japan surrendered. The war ended exactly as Yamamoto had predicted it would end on June 5, 1942, with Japanese defeat. The intelligence failure at Midway, the dismissal of the warning intercept, had not caused Japanese defeat, but it had ensured that Japanese defeat would come through a long war of attrition that Japan could not win, rather than being prevented by a decisive Japanese victory that might have forced American negotiation. History turned on a message intercepted in static, on a decision made in a basement office at Kure Naval Base, on an intelligence officer's judgment that a warning was deception rather than genuine intelligence. And in the turning of history on this small decision, the fates of millions were determined.